Hey everyone, tonight we're going to start with the incredible and much overlooked destinies of female pirates. That's when things became really intriguing. These were ladies who wore breeches, commandeered ships, and defied their times until they were apprehended. The narrative was straightforward when the typical pirate was apprehended: rope, trial, crown applause, and perhaps some vomit from onlookers during the hanging. The entire legal system, however, screeched to a halt like a drunk horse crashing into a church wall when a pirate was apprehended, unmasked, and shown to be a woman. You know, the 1600s and 1700s legal system was really effective at putting men to death. Male pirates? Simple. Hang them swiftly, high, and in a place that will be visible enough to deter the next person with a bad career plan and a cutlass. However, female pirates? The playbook didn't call for that. Didn't call for sheep, stealing, witchcraft, and unintentionally marrying your cousin's cousin were all prohibited. However, there was no guidance on what to do when the ruthless raider was discovered to be wearing pants, or worse, a corset. There was a moral and administrative collapse following the discovery of a female pirate. Everyone in the courtroom would first squint, blink a few times, and then intelligently question, "But where's her husband?" Because it is obvious that a woman cannot be making the decision to live a life of crime on her own. Some man had to be to blame, or that of Satan, or both. Lady pirates and other inconvenient anomalies was the portion that the judges would feverishly search through old law texts for. They would argue if they found nothing. Is she angry, owned, crazy? Is this a sophisticated practical joke of some sort? The accused woman, who was well aware that she had just gutted a few officers the week before, would sit there composedly, most likely grinning. Some courts now took the anticipated action. She was given a hanging sentence, preferably before lunch. Others changed their minds. Perhaps it was the publicity. Perhaps it was the persistent worry of hanging a charming, well-armed person. Perhaps they simply didn't want to tell the archbishop why they had put a woman in pants to death. Thus, female pirates frequently found themselves in an odd state of limbo, half curiosity, half criminal. Some received the cell, some the rope, and some— We'll get there, though. However, one thing was for sure. Women with swords, views, and no patience for legal jargon were not welcome in the courts. Anne Bonny was not easily frightened. Most men, including those who sentenced her to death, were highly displeased with her since she was Irish, red-haired, violent, and unlikable. When she was finally apprehended in 1720, Jamaican authorities anticipated that she would cry, plead for forgiveness, and perhaps give a heartfelt monologue about God or knitting. She gave sarcasm instead. Anne stood next to her co-conspirator, Mary Read, in court, and listened courteously as she was given the death penalty. Then, in typical Bonny form, she remarked, "You wouldn't be hanging like a dog if you had fought like a man." Yes, a little impolite. At least she maintained a nautical tone. Anne wasn't finished, of course, because Anne Bonny, the ultimate pirate, had one more secret under her sleeve. She was expecting a child, or claimed to be. No one requested a message from a midwife. A woman carrying a child could not be put to death under British law in the 18th century. Something about not wanting to kill two birds with one rope, or about the mercy of God. As any astute lady facing the gallows would, Anne took this action. She moaned, not her naivete, her abdomen, and it was successful. The execution was postponed by the court. It's uncertain whether Anne was indeed pregnant, or if she was just acting impulsively due to a sudden need for mangoes. According to certain historians, it was true. Others believe it was a brilliant piece of theatre. In any case, Anne escaped the noose. She was taken to prison, where she conveniently disappeared from official records, while the majority of her male staff dangled like wind chimes in a hurricane. Naturally, there are rumors that she established a new life, wore breeches till the end, and likely insulted everyone in the process. Her wealthy father also reportedly paid for her release. She definitely did not hang. It is essentially retirement in pirate parlance. Her situation wasn't merely unique, it created an odd precedent. Pirate trials abruptly took on the appearance of an Elizabethan maternity ward. As if it were a common legal maneuver, female pirates started to plead pregnant. I disagree, Your Honor. In addition, I have a child. Anne Bonny did more than simply circumvent the system. She made it seem bad. She made a courtroom acknowledge that knowing your reproductive rights may sometimes make piracy less deadly. Mary Red was steel, stoic, blunt, and built like someone who could defeat Poseidon in an arm wrestling match. But Anne Bonny was fire. Inconveniently, Mary wound up in court charged with piracy and sentenced to hang immediately next to Anne because she spent the majority of her pirate life fighting and dressing like a male. Mary, like Anne, used pregnancy as a legal escape route in the 18th century. She also used her stomach, which may seem like a weak excuse, but it was actually the earliest escape route in history. The court delayed her execution because it couldn't argue with biology. However, this is where Mary's story takes a ruthless turn. Mary didn't receive a second act in contrast to Anne, who mysteriously disappeared into suburbia or mythology. Mary became ill while confined in Jamaica's notoriously filthy and utterly uninspiring prison cells, probably due to a confluence of illness, pregnancy issues, and the usual atmosphere of rotting food and tropical hopelessness. Her giving birth is not documented. She died quietly in her cell. No last duel, no heroic escape, no sardonic courtroom zinger. For one of the toughest women in piracy, it was just illness and a bleak end. It appears that history occasionally prefers its legends to be unfinished. Some claim that she passed away from dysentery, jail fever, possibly typhus, or some quaint colonial combination of the two. Others speculate that the birth may not have gone well. The outcome was the same in either case. No freedom, but also no gallows. While the wig-wearing men argued about whether she was ladylike enough to hang, she was just another woman whose narrative ended in a forgotten cell. Perhaps this is the sad symmetry of pirate, when there is swashbuckling at sea and quiet on land. Yet her death was less exciting than her life. Instead of leaving behind a map of riches or a history of bloodshed, Mary Red left behind a silent reminder that even the most ferocious pirates could be defeated by something as commonplace as illness and red tape. Halfway around the world, a woman named Ching Shi was playing pirate on hard level and winning, while Anne Bonny and Mary Red were becoming legendary in the Caribbean. Ching Shi was not in charge of a crew of 30 drunken sloopmen. No, she was in charge of a whole fleet. Depending on whether your source is a historian or someone attempting to impress a date, she commanded approximately 300 ships and between 20,000 and 80,000 pirates at her height in the early 19th century. She was a floating, tax-evading empire in addition to being a pirate queen. Additionally, Ching Shi was not apprehended like Bonny and Red were because she possessed the intelligence and audacity to avoid being caught. Ching Shi made a bold move as the Portuguese ships, Chinese navy, and even British forces attempted and failed to stop her. She bargained with all of them simultaneously. She marched directly into the Guangdong governor's office, calmly outlined her demands, and somehow persuaded the Chinese authorities to forgive her and all of her pirates, and even to allow her to keep the loot. Yes, she retired with her head intact, her money intact, and her dignity intact. Imagine Captain Jack Sparrow entering Parliament declaring, "I resign," and then receiving a business license and a pension. That's pretty much what took place. Following her retirement, she started a gaming establishment. Because she did, of course. Returning to knitting after operating a maritime mafia is challenging. Technically speaking, Ching Shi does not match the typical storyline because she was never caught. Her tale is significant, though, since she demonstrated that being a female pirate need not result in execution or terrible obscurity. Occasionally, it resulted in survival, strategy, and a smug retirement. Because she changed the laws rather than breaking them, governments were unsure on how to handle female pirates like her. She wasn't playing courtroom drama or swinging from ropes. She was managing supply lines, handling logistics, and using power maneuvers that unnerved warlords. Ching Shi did more than just stay out of trouble. She worked her way out of it and left with more money than the majority of the individuals who ever attempted to apprehend her. If you were a pirate in the majority of 18th century courtrooms, you were doomed. Suddenly, however, things were strangely forgiving if you were a pregnant pirate. Welcome to the realm of pleading the belly, a term used to avoid physical class but really having English common law roots as a legal defense. The concept was straightforward. Even the legal systems of the 1700s understood that it would be unpopular to execute a pregnant lady because it would be the death of an innocent person. Therefore, a female pirate just needed to state that she was pregnant when she was put on trial. She only needed enough confidence to start the delay. She didn't require confirmation right then. A group of ladies known as a jury of matrons would then be chosen by the court to examine the prisoner and determine whether or not she was telling the truth, often with no training and with the most uncomfortable appearance. Let's pretend the science was vague. You may get off if you burp too boldly. You might still hang if you appeared too thin. In fact, there were some pregnant pirates. Others were obviously bluffing, stuffing oranges or rags into their shirts, or just crossing their fingers and hoped the matrons were either really philanthropic or half-blind. However, it purchased time once the plea was successful, months or even years. Furthermore, incarceration was not always equivalent to death. It was an opportunity. That meant escape for some. Others had to hope that a pardon came through, that public curiosity waned, or that a bribe found its way into the appropriate powdered wig. For their part, judges were frequently irritated. Being outwitted by pirates was not something they liked, much less pregnant pirates who showed up in their courtroom with legal loopholes and sarcasm. However, the law was what it was. The court had to wait if the accused had a baby on board, even if she had previously set fire to a commerce ship for pleasure. It was a conflict between justice and reproduction. Piracy meets technicalities. Reproduction also triumphed more frequently than anticipated. Because they were either very pregnant or very persuasive, some female pirates lasted longer than the majority of male pirates, who met a quick and violent death. In any case, it was successful, and the court was left saying, "She pleads the belly," once more, flushed and agitated. Authorities had to respond to an even more unpleasant question when the courtroom drama was over and the execution was either postponed or avoided completely. What comes next? A female pirate couldn't be allowed to simply leave. "Where's my ship?" She'd be back at sea before you could say it. You also couldn't put her in a normal jail without making a big deal out of it. Ultimately, the majority of prisons were built for males who stole chickens, not for women who stabbed officials and assaulted cargo vessels. The clumsy dance of pirate storage started. Female pirates were frequently housed in temporary detention cells, repurposed rooms in forts, deserted homes, or, in the worst cases, chained up in an unwelcome location, such as a wet cellar beneath a governor's office. These lodgings were hardly glitzy. Think bad Airbnb in hell rather than Pirates of the Caribbean. They were occasionally imprisoned alongside other women. Moral panic resulted from that. For what if their pirate thoughts spread like a virus? What would happen if the other women had ambition? In other instances, they were detained under stricter security than real killers, all by themselves. Why? Since they were frightening. Not only for their offenses, but also because they had already disregarded the most important unspoken rule of the day, that of women who were indifferent to men's opinions. Frequently, Prison guards were unsure of how to deal with them. Do you treat her like a lady, like a criminal, like a wild force of nature with a blade stashed in an inconvenient place and a sailor's vocabulary? For example, there were no training manuals. The situation worsened if the female pirate was well known. Newspapers published graphic headlines, locals would congregate to stare, and some guards began accepting bribes to admit onlookers. The pirate lady was the first genuine crime sideshow in history, and yes, people paid to see it. Prison, however, was ultimately a gamble. The situation was terrible. There was disease everywhere. In essence, medical care was, "Here's a bucket, good luck." A few pirates passed away in silence. Others hung on, getting older, more irate, and more forgotten each year. It was better than the gallows, though. Seldom. Authorities occasionally resorted to the most perplexing answer of all when they were unsure of what to do with a caught female pirate, and the prison was overcrowded, awkward, or simply too disorganized. Union. Indeed it is. Sometimes governments thought, you know what may fix this, rather than putting a woman who had spent years stealing from ships to death or imprisoning her eternally. A husband, handing over a convicted pirate to a poor man who believed he was only in town to purchase sugar, is the epitome of justice. The reasoning, if it can be called that, was that she would become more civilized through marriage. The pirate's spirit would undoubtedly fade if confined to a dull husband and an even duller home life. The issue was resolved after a few years of babysitting, laundry, and passive-aggressive dinner talks. Perhaps as a result of their survival instinct, some female pirates embraced their destiny. For others, it was the pinnacle of undercover operations. Silently evading execution, they transitioned from wielding cutlasses to stirring porridge. This idea, of course, sometimes backfired. For some women, marriage served as the beginning of a new, subtly rebellious life. They concealed firearms in kitchens. They gave their kids names that sounded eerily nautical. It's also difficult to get thrilled about sewing curtains after commanding a ship and staring down naval cannons, let's face it. In other instances, women made marriage a part of their legal agreement. In return for freedom and a romance that is approved, a pirate may consent to testify against her gang. The courts, willing to ignore everything, frequently agreed. After all, the issue was theoretically resolved if she was in a garden somewhere, barefoot, and away from the waters. Since mutual crime is the epitome of romance, she occasionally wed another pirate. However, this answer also reveals more about the perception of female offenders by the authorities. Justice was not what they desired. They desired authority, and attaching a wild woman to a man is the best way to keep her in check. It was a proposal for parole. Apron-induced amnesia. Additionally, many of these women were still pirates in spirit, but with improved disguises, even though it worked in a few instances. You should have seen the 18th century version if you believed that controversy was the lifeblood of today's media. The pamphlets flew quicker than cannonballs when a female pirate was apprehended, put on trial, or even only suspected of existing. Broadsheets, gossip rags, and newspapers all had a great time. They printed stories of harlots with hatchets, cutthroats in corsets, and she-devils of the sea. A few of the stories were based on actual occurrences. The majority weren't. But it was never about accuracy. Sales were. Female pirates quickly rose to fame in tabloids. Audiences lined up to watch their trials, which were transformed into theatrical productions, not because they were interested in justice, but rather because they wanted to see everything at once. They were portrayed in several periodicals as tragic individuals who were misled by evildoers and temptation fueled by rum. Others leaned heavily toward horror, portraying them as ruthless creatures disguised as sailors who stabbed men for amusement or worse. The horror. The courts found themselves in an odd predicament as a result of this popular attention. They ran the risk of martyring her if they put her to death. They appeared weak if they spared her. In any case, they were unable to prevail, particularly at a time when every possible result was printed and offered for sale for 1 penny on every corner. The attention was resented by the authorities. They objected to their trials becoming soap operas. The female pirates did not conform to tidy legal classifications. Even worse, they conversed. Some of the testimonies were humorous. The judges were ridiculed by others. Some made scathing political comments that likely caused courtroom clerks to silently choke on their ink. And the general public loved it. This unanticipated celebrity status was beneficial in certain situations. For the only reason that the authorities want to prevent criticism, a female pirate who garnered enough public interest or sympathy might receive a reduced punishment. Her execution could incite indignation or worse, lead to imitations. Not everyone was fortunate, of course. Notoriety could change rapidly. You went from being a misunderstood rebel to Satan's saber-wielding spawn with just one poor headline. However, this is the main point. Female pirates recognized the importance of controlling the narrative even before Instagram. They sold newspapers, created headlines, and occasionally used their words to gain survival. There were dozens, perhaps hundreds, of female pirates whose names were never documented, whose trials were never documented, and whose fates were silently buried beneath layers of dust and indifference. For every Anne Bonny or Chingshire who found their way into books, ballads, and poorly thought-out Halloween costumes. History is finicky, you know. It recalls the loud, the colourful, and the indefatigable. However, many female pirates who were captured weren't legendary. They were only human. Wives of sailors who become pirates in order to live. Tavern girls who discovered they were more adept at stabbing than serving after boarding a ship. While some may have joined purely for the adventure, others may have been born into it. However, they did not make headlines after being apprehended. They were forgotten. Why? Since they weren't consistent with the story. Instead of complicating female criminals, authorities wanted them to serve as warning tales. A lady turns into a monster if she is very fierce. She disappeared from the record, too quiet. Since they, quite bluntly, caused discomfort to the men in authority, the majority were pushed into unmarked graves, written off as anonymous wenches, and excluded from the official narrative. A woman captured at sea is mentioned in prison logs, but no further details are provided. A female accomplice is mentioned in court documents, as though her anonymity somehow diminished her legitimacy. Additionally, women's stories perished with them because literacy was not common, and they were discouraged from writing memoirs or anything else. Others may have been discreetly put to death without a trial, sold into slavery, or perished in prison. Some might have fled, disappearing into anonymity, and perhaps beginning a life in a place where people didn't inquire too much about tattoos of sailors and sword scars. However, their silence leaves a distinct legacy, one based on erasure rather than celebrity. Like evidence at a royal scandal, they were ignored because they were uncomfortable and disturbed orderly history. However, their existence was significant even if we are unaware of their names. Each one was a hole in the wall, a reminder that women did not merely exist in history, but also fought, bled, and occasionally even led it. Even though they were deleted from the script and offstage, they were present, even though they might not have made it into the spotlight. They are the most pirate-like of all, which is ironic. Let's assume that the court did not hang her, put her in a life sentence, or arrange for her to be married off like a strange, state-sponsored dating program. Then what? Why, of course, reform her? Ultimately, society couldn't simply abandon a former pirate. It would be risky. She could read it, or worse, encourage other women to defy authority. The next best thing, then, make her a respectable woman. Yes, 18th century style therapy. It was an easy strategy. Teach stitching to this blood-soaked, sea-hardened woman who used to command soldiers in cannon fire, because there's nothing like cross-stitching a gorgeous pillow to heal a history of violent marine theft. Convents housed some of the women, while homes for fallen women, a tactful way of saying state-funded guilt traps with awful food, housed others. There, people were urged, and frequently coerced, to turn from their faults, repent, and change. Ideally, in grey clothing, a significant role was played by religious instruction. It was thought that even if she had robbed 30 ships and perhaps have killed someone with a table leg, she would be essentially fixed if she committed the Lord's Prayer to memory. It worked in some instances. In another, the pirate in question planned her escape while courteously nodding her way through the sermon. Let's also not act as though this was ever about being saved. It has to do with appearance. These women's stories about how they once seized a Spanish galleon using only their courage and a crude joke were not welcome by governments when they returned to ships or bars. They desired them to be silent, innocuous, and invisible. Reform thus turned into a strategy to control the issue and reintegrate female pirates into the secure, submissive role of women. Mend clothing, bake bread, and forget you were the leader of a revolt once. However, the pirate spirit is difficult to subdue. Some of these women changed their names, went back to sea, and continued in silence. Others got married and managed their households like ships, organized, noisy, and perhaps armed. Some female pirates, it turns out, didn't have to learn to crochet, pretend to be married, or plead the belly. All they had to do was speak, quite loudly, and about everybody. Welcome to the less glitzy, but incredibly successful way to avoid execution. Spying. Information was constantly, desperately needed by authorities. They wanted more than simply pirates apprehended. They desired the destruction of networks, the discovery of routes, and the seizure of ships. So, ears pricked up when a captured woman offered to provide names, localities, and the locations of Captain So-and-so's booty. Some of these women had dirt, let's face it. They were aware of which harbours ignored Thursday's events, had sailed with ruthless crews, and had overheard plots over rum spills. Under the fear of being hanged, their memories became extremely acute and valuable. In return, forgiveness, sentences that are shorter, or at least a somewhat less rat-infested cage, and a postponed execution. Don't take this as cowardice, though. It wasn't always simple to come forward. Informants were treated like trash fire by pirate codes, particularly among Caribbean crews. Loyalty, however, becomes negotiable when you're facing the hangman, and he's already checking the knot tension. This strategy was employed by some women to buy time. Others walked free with it. Some even made it their full-time job, helping naval intelligence track down their old pals. When a lady who once led a mutiny is now in a courtroom, nonchalantly directing her former shipmate to her hiding place, you know you've witnessed drama. Chilled, perhaps. Successful, very much so. Here's the twist, though. At the very least, several of these informants exaggerated or lied. They would make up whole smuggling networks, name persons who were already deceased, or say they once had a dinghy with Blackbeard's ghost. The authorities devoured it, frequently too bureaucratic to verify. Was it always successful? No. Even after sharing what they knew, several women were nonetheless put to death. However, others left without incident, most likely giggling as they made their way back to a sleepy seaside community where nobody was aware that they had once threatened a Spanish captain with a hot poker. The ultimate pirate flip was becoming an informant. Less cutlass, more clipboard, less heroic, more strategic. Not all female pirates managed to escape the noose. There were others who made it to the end of the rope. For every Anne Bonny who pled her belly or Qing Shi, who out-negotiated an empire. Literally. It wasn't quiet when they did. In the 18th century, public executions were common. Large crowds gathered, street sellers, aristocrats, peasants, and kids with dubious upbringing. Everyone was there to witness a spectacle, the last act of a pirate's life, ideally one that included dramatic eye contact, final remarks, and a poem about sin and the sea. A woman, though, being publicly hanged. That level of cultural curiosity was entirely different. It was scandalous, it was forbidden. Unfortunately, ticket sales were excellent. These incidents were frequently viewed by authorities as opportunities for moral instruction encased in gallows ropes. The states appear to say, "See what happens when women disobey." This is the result of too much independence, liquor, and pants. However, the audience wasn't always cooperative. With a sharp tongue or outright rebellion, several female pirates won over the audience. They would wink at the executioner to make him uneasy, deliver scathing remarks to the judges below, or approach the scaffold without flinching. According to reports, one even reprimanded the priest for being uninteresting during her final ceremonies. Legendary. Others sung hymns, grieved, and prayed for forgiveness. Some remained mute till the very end, saying nothing at all. Regardless matter their response, it was recorded in the public domain. Already, the newspaper lads were writing it down for the scandal sheet of the following day. The final curse of Lady Pirate prior to the plummet. In an attempt to make a point, the states occasionally attempted to stage manage these killings. Messages, however, are amusing. People would sometimes only leave with admiration, particularly when the condemned appeared more dignified, astute, or just plain brave than the powdered men observing from the balcony. This is where the paradox is. Although female pirates were put to death in order to eradicate them, their deaths were frequently remembered for the drama they caused. The fact that they passed away was irrelevant. How they died was what counted. And a lot of people did this while giving the world the finger because they couldn't determine whether to be afraid of them, feel sorry for them, or act as though they didn't exist. For an exemplary pirate, death was never the end, not when there were myths to inflate, ballads to write, and history books frantically attempting to use women as metaphors. A female pirate's story frequently continued after her arrest, regardless of whether she was hung, imprisoned, or inexplicably withdrew into retirement. It was rewritten instead. Of course, not by her, but by men. Most of them were guys with quills, dubious intentions, and an obsessive fixation with moral teachings. These ladies were sculpted like clay by writers. She was a tragic seductress if she passed away young. She was a warning story if she lived. She was either a phony or a freak if she was able to outsmart the system. Complexity. I had never heard of it. Real truths were eventually obscured by layers of narrative glitz. With a cutlass in one hand and a bottle of rum in the other, Anne Bonny turned into a frenzied redhead. She transformed Mary Red into her devoted sidekick. Numerous other women were condensed into the same stale headline, and Qing Shi was reduced to a cartoon of exotic peril. As if pants were the main offense, she dressed like a man. Naturally, the tales of the pirates who completely avoided the record became part of mythology. In pulp stories and poetry, anonymous pirate queens appeared, frequently exhibiting uncanny similarities, seductive, vindictive, and bound to be punished. A lady with a happy ending was apparently the only thing worse than a woman with a sword. However, these tales occasionally backfired. As the centuries went by, readers began to view female pirates as icons, independent, rebellious, and dangerous in all the right ways, instead of as cautionary stories. Instead of frightening people into submission, the same stories made them wonder, wait, why weren't there more of them? And the legacy is that, in real life, these women faced persecution, trials, and punishment. They were deleted, sensationalized, or distorted in death. In legend, however, they flourished. They became defiant symbols, clumsy, intricate, and deliciously awkward reminders that women were more than just historical figures. They shook its bones. Why weren't there more female pirates, you might ask, after hearing the tales of Ching Shi and Bonnie Red? Were they truly so few, or were they just never permitted to be recalled? Sexism is the short answer. Body odor and frail masculinity are liberally sprinkled with institutional, cultural, marine, legal, and logistical sexism. Ships were spaces dominated by men for starters. Due to superstition, ill luck, and the long-held notion that if a woman joined a journey, everyone would become distracted and crash into a rock, many fleets and private crews openly prohibited women from traveling on board. It seems that a pair of hips may ruin millennia of navigation instruction. Women who sailed frequently had to wear disguises, deep voices, flattened chests, scarves, and trousers. To be permitted on deck, they had to lead double lives. And they weren't praised if they were found. Frequently, they were tossed overboard or worse. This was hardly a society that accepted female aggression, much less female ambition. Misogyny persisted even in the criminal underworld. Even if they were hideous killers, male pirates may nonetheless acquire monikers, songs, and likable biographies. In contrast, a female pirate was either a seductress, an anomaly, or the personification of supernatural evil. There was no compromise. Additionally, the same limited perspective was used to sift the experiences of women who were apprehended. Officials dismissed them as being mistakes, pirate spouses, or camp followers. Their existence was considered an insult, but their offenses were not regarded seriously. Therefore, it's likely that there were more female pirates than we realize. However, they received footnotes, or worse, silence, instead of the headlines, the trials, or the ballads. That deletion was intentional, not a coincidence. The rebels in history like to be predictable. Furthermore, a woman with a cutlass, a crew, and no desire to make anyone feel at ease is anything but predictable. The loudest, bravest, and nearly impossible to ignore were the handful who made it into history books. The others? Buried beneath the belief that piracy was a boys' club, they disappeared into the mist of anonymous seafarers. But let's face it, neither the gunpowder nor the sea gave a damn about gender. The only ones who did so were the record writers. After being captured, what became to the female pirates? Some were married, some pled pregnant, some were executed, some died in prison, some bargained their way out. One negotiated a retirement package any CEO would be jealous of, and the most were forgotten. What their captures tell us about the world around them, a society where women wielding swords are more terrifying than entire armadas, is the true tale, not just what happened to them when they were captured. These were ladies who disregarded the law, geography, fashion, and expectations. When society advised them to stay at home, they boarded ships. When instructed to be kind, they killed. As instructed, they took the lead. When they were eventually trapped, society punished them for being outside of the roles that had been assigned to them, not simply for piracy. Execution, incarceration, forced rehabilitation, or easy historical forgetfulness are all responses to their capture that reveal more about the profound discomfort they caused than their misdeeds. They were women who refused to behave, not because they were pirates. Even if their stories were diverse and unfinished, they were nevertheless able to upend neat narratives. They compel us to look past historical parodies and into the faces of actual individuals who were complex, witty, irate, resourceful, and occasionally really exhausted. They were criminals, to be sure. Just because someone wore a stylish hat while committing murder or theft doesn't mean that it should be romanticized. Let's not pretend, however, that the men they sailed with were likewise saints. The sole distinction? It was assumed that the males would be aggressive, not the women. They were hazardous because of that. After being captured, what became to the female pirates? They received punishment, they vanished. They were reframed as warning stories. They were then brought back to life centuries later. They serve as a reminder that the winners are not the only ones who write history. Survivors occasionally rewrite it. Additionally, the canon isn't always the loudest echo in history. The voice belongs to someone who was never meant to speak. Let's begin with ancient Sumer, the cradle of civilization, and perhaps the origin of the hangover. Imagine this. You weren't having juice or coffee for breakfast 4,000 years ago in the hot city of Ur. Not at all. You are downing a clay cup of warm, murky beer that is thick enough to chew on and nourishing enough to be considered a meal. It had more fermented barley sludge and less citrusy IPA, which the Sumerians called Kaz. And it was sacred, if you believe that. They drank more than beer, they revered it. Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, had a recipe in her own hymn. You are the one who soaks the malt in a jar, according to the lyrics. Spreading the cooked mash is your responsibility. You understand. The remainder was done by yeast and divine intervention. In Sumer, beer wasn't for gatherings, it was for life. Everybody drank it, women, children, farmers, and priests. It kept you sufficiently intoxicated to forget the numerous fees the temple had just imposed on your grain, was safer than the water, and was simpler to prepare than wine. Stranger still, the money was beer. Employees were paid for it, up to 5 liters a day at times. Imagine receiving a payment from your boss that you can physically drink after a long day of moving bricks for a ziggurat. After making a toast to the gods, you would immediately faint. Speaking of deities, temples served as more than just houses of worship. The breweries were industrial. Holy zeal was used by high priests to oversee production. Yes, women controlled the brewing industry as brew mistresses, creating the miraculous beverage in enormous clay vats, with hands smeared with barley mash and perhaps a hint of hubris. They shared it using long reed straws that were inserted into enormous jars to filter out the bits rather than for aesthetic purposes. It was heated, gritted, and utterly holy. Most significantly, though, Sumerian beer reveals something deep. Fermentation was a survival tactic, not just a way to get drunk. Grain stocks were expanded, water was purified, and a society in which intoxication was not frowned upon was established. It was anticipated. The Egyptians gave beer flair if the Sumerians gave it spirit. Beer was more than simply a beverage in ancient Egypt. It was almost considered a food group. Made from barley and emmer wheat, it was thick, sweet, and high in calories. It was frequently sweetened with herbs or dates. It's not quite a smoothie or a beer. What if oatmeal decided to have a party? Everyone, including pharaohs and pyramid laborers, drank beer. Workers were regularly provided daily rations of bread, onions, and beer, according to tomb inscriptions. If you enjoyed carbohydrates with a side of hallucinations, this is a classic lunch combo. It was an easy belief. Beer created monuments, maintained life, and perhaps, just perhaps, lessened the heartbreak of carrying 2.5-ton chunks of limestone. The beverage was even popular with the gods. The first barmaid in Egypt was the goddess Hathor, who also served as the patroness of music, happiness, and drunken dancing. However, it was the alleged drinking problem of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of battle and fury, that might have rescued humanity. Myth says that Sekhmet went on a divine rampage because he became a little too excited about punishing people. Ra deceived her by turning thousands of jugs of beer red and sprinkling them over the fields to make them look like blood. Sekhmet drank it all because he believed it to be authentic. Humanity survived because of one hell of a beer run, and she passed out in a lovely drunken slumber. Beer was also taken seriously in Egyptian temples. The beverage was frequently offered to the gods or the deceased, and some had their own breweries. You did not want to go into the hereafter with nothing. It was simply ill-prepared. You had a respectable buzz and were prepared for eternity with a couple jars of beer tucked within your tomb. It's interesting to note that beer was seen as a craft for women. Women were mostly responsible for brewing, frequently in the home, and some went on to become official figures, such as mistress of the house of beer. Indeed, beer ladies existed in ancient Egypt before pyramids. Egyptian beer was ultimately more than just a drink. It represented vigor, fertility, and heavenly favor. One hangover at a time, Sekhmet's story may also be able to avert the end of the world. The ancient Greeks essentially made wine their national identity, if Sumer and Egypt worshipped beer. Indeed, they would likely view beer with the same suspicion and hazy savagery that we do gas station sushi. For a Greek, a well-structured toast and fermented grapes were the foundation of true civilization. In Greece, wine was more than just a beverage. It served as a lubricant for the intellect. And what became of that lubricating intelligence? The symposium began with an all-male drunken drinking party that was a mix of late-night therapy sessions, TED Talks, and frat houses. Imagine a group of philosophers wearing tunics lounging on sofas, drinking diluted wine from clay cups, and discussing the universe, the nature of love, and sometimes who stole whose goat. Diluted indeed. It was rare for the Greeks to drink their wine directly. It was regarded as barbarous to do so, indicating that you were either a Thracian warlord or had severe boundary disputes. About 1 part wine to 3 parts water was the right ratio, just enough to keep you alert and a touch dramatic. The symposiarch, who was essentially the wine cop and party planner, oversaw the entire affair. He set the drinking rate, the dilution ratio, and occasionally even the intellectual tone of the evening. Imagine Socrates and a contemporary DJ, but without the lasers and with more moralizing. But wine wasn't only for gatherings, it was symbolic, sacred, and therapeutic. Hippocrates and other physicians recommended it for everything from depression to intestinal problems. The pleasure and peril of the beverage were personified by Dionysus, the god of wine, insanity, and ecstasy. He may be worshipped through music, dance, trance, or complete insanity. Wine, like anything Greek, has its class distinctions. The wealthy had servants continuously refilling their kylixes, and they drank mature vintages from imported amphorae. The impoverished were given the leftovers, which were inexpensive, sharp, and best eaten with a piece of lowly pie. Nevertheless, alcohol was the golden thread that connected the sacred and the secular for the Greeks. Before each meal, it was poured forth as libations to the gods. It came with vows, sacrifices, marriages, burials, and uncomfortable pronouncements of love to the cousin of your best friend's husband. Wine made you Greek, not simply inebriated. Although they did not create wine, the Romans did make it a weapon. Wine was propaganda to them, not merely a pleasure. It was the liquid expression of Roman civilization. You were civilized if you drank wine, otherwise you were a savage. You were probably still a senator if you drank too much. From the rough terrain of Gaul to the slopes of Italy, Roman grapes were found all over the empire. Legionnaires were rationed wine along with bread and olive oil since it was so necessary. This was a calculated move, not merely an act of kindness. A soldier who was buzzed was more likely to be loyal, or at the very least less likely to rebel before lunch. However, it wasn't just practicalities of the vineyard and war. Here comes Bacchus, the Roman deity of wine, excitement, and dubious choices. Bacchanalia, wild, covert festivals with drinking, dancing, and a suspicious lack of toga were all part of his worship. These gatherings, which began as sacred ceremonies, swiftly evolved into the most exclusive raves in antiquity, that is, until 186 BCE, when the Roman Senate became uneasy and outlawed them. Senators were apparently waking up in fountains in excess. However, the passion for wine was difficult to eradicate. Like contemporary sommeliers, Rome even categorized wines. They knew how long it had aged in an amphora and which vintage was from which location. The most valuable, Campania's robust sweet wine, is called Falernian. Without the corks, it's essentially the Dom Perignon of its time. There were class distinctions in Roman wine, just as there are today. The elites drank expensive wines that were frequently flavored with herbs, honey, or even seawater. Laura, the ancient counterpart of boxed wine mixed with sorrow, is a thin, vinegary sludge prepared from rehydrated grape skins that the impoverished may use. However, wine was not only drunk, politics was involved. While some, like you, Nero and Caligula, transformed their dinner parties into full-fledged theatrical disasters, others, like Augustus, utilized it to demonstrate moderation and piety. Things were most likely going south if your emperor began poisoning visitors or combining wine with powdered pearls. If you look closely enough, you can see that wine was served during sacrifices, funerals, victories, and even baby showers in ancient Rome. It stoked ambition, placated failure, and sometimes smothered the moral compass of an empire. They answered, "In vino veritas, in wine truth," or plausible deniability at the absolute least. The Celts were drinking golden mead from toddler-sized drinking horns, while the Greeks and Romans were whirling wine in painted cups and spouting philosophy. To be honest, they appeared to be enjoying themselves far more. Celtic tribes throughout Gaul, the British Isles, and into modern-day Germany preferred mead, that old concoction of honey, water, and wild yeast. The nectar of druids and warriors alike, it was sweet, strong, and glowed like sunlight in a cup. Mead was unadulterated, primordial, and intricately linked to nature and magic, in contrast to wine, which had a hint of urban sophistication. For the Celts, drinking was a full-contact sport rather than merely a recreational activity. Warriors would recite poetry, argue over seating placements, and boast of previous glory during feasts or banquets, which took place in timber halls. The mead would flow freely, frequently poured by a prominent lady known as the mead giver, who was not only serving beverages but also establishing hierarchy and prestige. One drink may make you famous or leave you without pants and with a black eye at the end of the night. Then there were the bearded mystics known as druids, who were said to have used mead in their ceremonies. Particularly following the third cup, mead was thought to be able to open the mind to heavenly inspiration. Prophecy, fertility, and possibly the delusion that your cow was speaking Latin were all connected to it. This hallowed humming was represented even in burial traditions. Cauldrons and drinking cups buried with high-status people have been found during archaeological investigations. Many of them still contain traces of fermented grain or honey, suggesting that a Celt wasn't likely to be caught intoxicated, even in the afterlife. Mead wasn't the only choice, though. In addition, beer was widely consumed and frequently flavored with herbs like yarrow, heather, or bog myrtle, which produced flavor, moderate intoxicating effects, and the occasional forest hallucination. Only as a luxury item for chiefs and monarchs to flaunt to Roman envoys was wine imported. The Norse essentially transformed mead into a cosmic contract, whilst the Celts transformed it into a boisterous ceremony. Alcohol was used for more than just feasting by the Vikings. It was a component of divine combat, the afterlife, and sometimes the spitting of gods that inspired poetry. Indeed, it is. First up is mead of poetry, a legendary concoction formed from the spit and blood of a wise man who was killed. According to Norse tradition, the gods made this mead by mistake and knew right once that they were dealing with liquid intelligence. Whoever drank it may write epic poetry or, more likely, recite rhyming, passionate, drunken babble. The Norse held that when one died valiantly, one went to Valhalla rather than a hazy heaven or a comfortable underworld. It was like a violent, never-ending Oktoberfest where you fought all day, died gloriously, revived, and drank unlimited mead supplied by Valkyries in Odin's grand hall. Hydrun, a legendary goat who perched on the roof of Valhalla and somehow generated a daily supply of honeyed ambrosia, is credited with creating this heavenly nectar. Nobody questioned it, not when the buzz was that strong, even though it's unknown what this goat ate or how the physics worked. On Earth, social and political life revolved on Norse mead halls. In addition to entertaining, chiefs hosted lavish feasts to establish alliances, demonstrate their might, and retain the allegiance of their troops. Consuming alcohol was a show. The gods, ancestors, and fallen allies were all toasted. Fueled by drunken courage and perhaps a few inflated recollections, Norse poets known as skalds performed sagas. Drinking horns were highly valued items that were frequently adorned with dragon, rune, and silver designs. They also came with regulations, much like anything Norse. You drank if someone offered you a horn. Refusal was an insult that may lead to a duel, or at least, be met with axe-throwing and awkward silence. Norse alcohol did not aim for perfection like Egyptian beer or Roman wine did. It was rough, metaphorical, and frequently powerful enough to conflate myth and man. Mead was drunk at weddings, funerals, before war, and sometimes even within the same week following a victory. Ancient China was quietly developing the science and ceremony of alcohol, while the West was preoccupied with poetic mead and barley brews. In addition to drinking, the Chinese used it as a religious tool, an art form, and occasionally as a high-stakes drinking game that determined political careers. First, let's talk about Ju, which is a broad term for alcoholic beverages that range from potent grain-based liquors to mild rice beers. As early as 7000 BCE, the earliest known Chinese alcohol was made by fermenting rice, honey, and fruit. This indicates that the Chinese were already making cocktails at the same time that the Sumerians were still learning how to use irrigation. However, in ancient China, alcohol was about timing, harmony, and balance, rather than getting sloshed for sport. According to Confucian philosophy, moderation was crucial. Even though you might like a drink, if you were careless at a banquet, you were not only making a fool of yourself, but also upsetting the universe's moral order. So, no pressure, you know. Chinese drinking culture was based on rituals. At state ceremonies and as offerings to heaven and earth, as well as to ancestors, alcohol was spilled. Ministers were supposed to drink at the lavish banquets that emperors held, but not excessively. You may wake up without a job or banished after making one bad toast. Then there were the games of drinking. Yes, there was more to ancient Chinese feasts than poetry and chopsticks. To decide who would drink next, they engaged in games using spinning arrows, dice, and riddles. The loser chugs, the winner chugs as well. It was more important to survive without bringing disgrace to anyone than it was to win. Alcohol was transformed into muse fuel by poets and academics. The renowned Tang dynasty poet Li Bai is known for penning his best poems while intoxicated, occasionally while attempting to embrace the moon's reflection in a river. He once said that all he needed to feel the universe open up was a pot of wine among the flowers. To be fair, after 3 shots of baijiu, everyone has experienced that one poetic moment. The alcohol itself changed as well, moving from murky rice wines to clear distilled spirits like baijiu and huangjiu, the latter of which was so strong that it could either cause or cure a wound sustained on the battlefield if it was distributed too widely. The ancient Indians may have been drinking their way to enlightenment, or at least attempting to, while other civilizations drank to party, presenting soma one of the most enigmatic and legendary beverages in history. Was it fermented plant juice, wine, or mushroom? Actually, nobody knows. We do know that it was powerful and holy. Soma was more than just a drink. It was mentioned more than 100 times in the earliest Vedic scripture, the Rig Veda. It was a live, breathing god that you could consume. The hymns described Soma as rushing like a steed, flowing in a golden stream, and giving the drinker a sense of immortality. The typical signs of too much ancient chemistry, you know. Priests ingested Soma during fire ceremonies and sacrifices because it was thought to provide clarity, divine vision, and perhaps even some epic hallucinations. Before being drank by humans, the beverage was offered to the gods after being pressed from an unidentified plant, combined with milk or water and filtered through wool. A divine chain of custody, huh? The priests asserted that they could see the sky split open and communicate with the thunder god Indra after consuming Soma. Not everyone was permitted to consume the holy substance, however, it is still debatable if that was true communion or perhaps early psychedelic microdosing. Soma, a sort of priestly joyous hour with cosmic ramifications, was limited to Brahmins and ritual experts. This is no place for casual drinking. Soma was not a social lubricant. Rather, it was an act of spiritual transcendence. The original Soma plant eventually vanished, possibly as a result of climate change, time, or someone inadvertently consuming the final patch while on a vision quest. Soma is more symbolically referred to as the nectar of the gods or the elixir of life in later writings, such as the Atharva Veda. According to some academics, Amrita, the Hindu mythological drink of immortality, is a spiritualized version of the ancient divine cocktail and its progression. Historians, botanists, and mystics are all still captivated by the enigma of Soma. Were the mushrooms hallucinogenic? A milkweed that has fermented? Something gone now? Whatever it was, it had a significant enough impact to mold a whole theological philosophy. Alcohol was considered sacred, therapeutic, social, and even completely disastrous in ancient societies. Somewhere there was a king sipping himself right into anarchy for every priest reciting praises over a sacred brew. Because fermentation has the potential to create empires, but it also had a tendency to depose the ruling class. Consider Alexander the Great, who subjugated the majority of the world. Yes, but also a known binge drinker who never recovered after downing a huge bowl of unmixed wine in a competition. Some claim that he died at the age of 32 from a combination of booze, weariness, and possibly poison. Some claim that believing you could outdrink your own troops was the true poison. During the Shang dynasty in China, King Di Xin gained notoriety for his lake of wine and forest of meat, which was a real lake of alcoholic beverages encircled by trees that were adorned with roasted animals. It sounds like the deadliest pool party in the world, and he asked people to drink till they passed out. The dynasty fell quickly after, spoiler alert. Startling. Not to be overlooked are the Roman emperors. Caligula combined insanity with wine. Often for himself, Nero drank until he cried at his theatrical banquets. Commodus was known to drink and fight in the arena, believing himself to be Hercules resurrected. All of them seen their reigns deteriorate into brutality, paranoia, and highly visible outbursts, frequently propelled by fermented grapes and a deep misinterpretation of moderation. The Norse sagas even forewarned against monarchs who drank excessively. An inebriated ruler was unable to stay upright during a feast or even hear the gods leading in war. Furthermore, slurring your speech in front of your troops was not only embarrassing, but also disqualified in a culture where honor was highly valued. Ancient writings from many cultures cautioned against binge drinking. Confucius advocated moderation. Spiritual distraction was cautioned against in Vedic hymns. Even the Greeks, who revered wine, had a limit on intoxication in public. The booze itself wasn't the issue. The loss of control was the cause. Everything else began to crumble the instant the cup became the king's ruler. Dogs were more than just companions in ancient Egypt. They served as status symbols, religious emblems, and occasionally even divine go-betweens. don't bother running after sticks in the backyard. Unlike most humans, these dogs were buried in tombs with more ceremony, lounged in palaces, and went on royal hunts. Pharaohs and aristocrats loved their dogs. Greyhounds were especially valued for their ability to hunt and their elegant appearance. These were no savage villagers. With names like Reliable, Brave One, and North Wind, real names that were inscribed on tomb walls, they were pampered, regal creatures. Some received personal attendants, jewelry, and titles. They were, in a sense, both minor royal court celebrities and pets. Religion was also closely associated with dogs. Anubis, the deity of embalming and the underworld, was linked to the jackal, Egypt's most canine-like animal. He wasn't merely a menacing presence that prowled around pyramids. Anubis was a guardian who led spirits through the afterlife. Many people thought that dogs also possessed this guiding force. They weren't just buried with their owners because of this. On occasion, they were mummified themselves, complete with painted masks, inscriptions, and tiny sarcophagi. And dog ownership wasn't limited to the wealthy. Archaeological evidence from rural dwellings and workmen's settlements demonstrates that dogs were also owned by common Egyptians. Even 3,000 years ago, humans were smuggling crumbs to the dog under the table, as evidenced by the kennels in some houses and the murals in others that showed playful pets beneath dinner tables. Grief is among the most prominent examples of Egypt's dog-loving culture. Inscriptions lamented the death of Intef's devoted dog, Behikai, in the grave of a nobleman. As though composing a eulogy for a departed comrade, the prose extols the dog's devotion, hunting prowess, and kind disposition. It's not difficult to see Intef holding a wine jug and becoming giddy about his former hunting companion. Dogs were well established in Egyptian homes and hearts by the time of the New Kingdom. They were more than just hunting implements or status symbols. They were related. Cats had divinity in ancient Egypt if dogs had rank. Not only were these feline friends loved, they were revered. In a culture that valued protection, balance, and order, the cat represented all three. It's no surprise that ancient Egyptians recognized magic in cats because they are graceful, poised, lethal to rodents, and enigmatic. The goddess Bastet was at the center of cat worship. Before becoming the sleek domestic cat goddess linked to home, fertility, music, and safety, Bastet was a fearsome lioness deity. Worshippers flocked to her temples, particularly the imposing one at Bubastis, where they offered food, jewelry, and, most astonishing of all, mummified cats, many of them, lovingly wrapped and laid to rest like kings and queens, thousands upon thousands. Consider a historic pet cemetery the size of a tiny community. However, cats were ingrained in everyday life and were not only revered in temples. They kept snakes out of houses and mice out of granaries. More significantly, they developed into cherished housemates. Cats are depicted in tomb paintings as being held by women like children, petted during meals, or allowed to recline under banquet chairs. Some cats even had golden earrings and ornamental collars. Yes, like fuzzy fashion models, ancient cats with bling wandered the hallways of lords' mansions. Because of the close relationship between humans and cats, even inadvertently hurting one could result in severe consequences, including death. Even accidentally killing a cat was punishable by death. That is written legislation, not a metaphor. During the Ptolemaic period, a Roman soldier was immediately executed by a mob after he killed a cat. Even the pharaoh did not step in. Many cats were treated like kings and queens when they passed away. Intricate wrappings, painted faces, and carved sarcophagi have all been discovered on mummified cats. Some were even interred beside their owners, or the other way around. In a poetic allusion to the afterlife, one woman's grave inscription describes her cat as her loved one who walks with me in the field of reeds. Ever the copycats and refiners, The Romans adopted the idea of pets and turned it into a way of life. An animal that was small enough to be held, cuddled, or trained to utter insults in Latin, most likely, ended up in a Roman villa. Monkeys, dogs, and birds. Someone in a toga had one if it was small enough to sit on a shoulder or fit on a lap. First, let's talk about lap dogs. Especially throughout the empire, wealthy Roman women loved small companion dogs, mostly from the East, and perhaps like the Maltese or Pekingese of today. These spoiled dogs were lavished with food, wore gold collars, and occasionally even had tiny couches of their own. One well-known lapdog, whose epitaph endures, was hailed as a friend who never growled excessively and as being softer than a dove. High marks, particularly in a senatorial city. Romans were not just fond of dogs, though. The aristocracy began to favor exotic birds, especially starlings and parrots. These birds were kept in elaborate cages and trained to speak, sometimes in Greek, sometimes in Latin, and frequently both. Before it sadly passed away from overexcitement, one parrot was said to have welcomed guests at banquets with a happy Ave. Its owner threw a proper funeral, complete with floral tributes and a speech. After all, Romans enjoyed spectacle even when it came to birds. Imported from far-flung regions of Africa and India, monkeys were also considered a prestige symbol. They were seen as entertaining, if sometimes erratic, additions to the family. Some were instructed to imitate domestic servants, while others were clad in small togas. They were adorable, cunning, and probably going to throw something disagreeable across the atrium, the original ancient pranksters. Dormice, which were indeed occasionally pets and occasionally supper, were also popular among the Romans. Those who wished to show off a little exotic flair kept peacocks, tortoises, and even snakes. A senator who had a peacock in his garden was expressing his affluence and his disregard for common sense. Pets were more than simply consolation, though. They were declarations of dominance, preference, and ties to other provinces. A Persian dog or a parrot that could recite Virgil was more than just a companion in a world of conquest and empire. It was a flex. Pets were more than simply toys in imperial China. They served as doors to beauty, discipline, and peace. Chinese emperors were secretly creating living art while Western aristocrats displayed their parrots and lapdogs, crickets chirping in carved cages, goldfish gliding in porcelain basins, and dogs representing luck, loyalty, or even cosmic equilibrium. First, let's talk about goldfish, not the food, but the show. Goldfish were more than just lovely. They were originally bred from carp during the Tang period. They were valued for their form, color, and peaceful demeanor. Emperors and academics were deliberately cultivating them during the Song dynasty, showcasing uncommon species in elaborate garden ponds and ceramic basins. It was soothing to watch their elegant movements, similar to browsing Instagram. There were crickets if Instagram had fins and flawless feng shui. Crickets, indeed. These small insects were housed in little bamboo or ivory cages and served as musical companions in addition to being pets. Their chirping was seen as spiritual, poetic, and soothing. Song period writers produced poetry extolling the peaceful melancholy of cricket song, while children in the Qing era nurtured them like sportsmen for chirping contests. Some were even given nicer food than the domestic help. Additionally, small lapdogs were favored, particularly by the nobility. Not only were Pekingese and Shih Tzu breeds adorable, but they also served as imperial symbols. They were revered, even semi-divine, and were bred to look like Chinese lions. According to legend, Pekingese people are sprung from lions who shrank themselves because they loved Buddhist monks. It's one of the rare stories with a cutesy, fluffy punchline, whether it's genuine or not. Because even your dog had protectors in the Forbidden City, these imperial canines were frequently groomed in silk-lined baskets, carried in sleeves, and watched over by eunuchs. However, the Chinese view of pets was based on both emotional and aesthetic discipline, not only cuteness. The goal of a pet was to foster patience, calm, and a sense of connectedness to the natural world. To observe a goldfish was to contemplate. It was an appreciation of impermanence to listen to a cricket. It was simply good taste to wear a Pekingese sleeve. Pets in ancient Mesoamerica served as more than simply adorable company. They were also used as spiritual advisors, prestige symbols, and occasionally as food. In all honesty, the Aztecs, Maya, and other societies enjoyed the hazy distinction between sacred entity and animal buddy. First up is the Xoloitzcuintli, also referred to as the Mexican hairless dog nowadays. It was bred for its deep spiritual function rather than its appearance, which was, let's say, acquired taste. It was thought that the Xolo was a psychopomp, a guide who transported deceased people's souls to the afterlife. In order to guarantee safe passage through the 9 perilous levels of the underworld, it was customary for a Xolo to be sacrificed and buried with the deceased. It was a noble job, but it wasn't precisely the happy ending that most pet owners hoped for. In addition, these canines served as guardians, friends, and, surprisingly, food during rituals. Indeed, they were roasted and adored. Something so spiritually important had to be honored in every way, including in terms of food, according to Mesoamerican thinking. The uncomfortable dinner discussion began. Then came the cubs of the jaguar. Jaguars were more than simply apex predators to the Aztecs and Maya. They were gods, soldiers, heavenly creatures, and living examples of might. In addition to showing off their position, elite leaders occasionally maintained jaguar kittens in royal zoos to communicate with supernatural power. Imagine a spotted death machine lounging next to a fountain in a nobleman's patio. You wouldn't doubt his sanity or authority. Another tamed animal that wasn't solely for the plate was the turkey. Turkeys were regarded as sacred messengers in Maya homes, where they were occasionally given names and kept within. They represented human sacrifices in ceremonies, a gobble-for-life exchange that historians undoubtedly value, but the turkey surely did not. People also loved parrots. Macaws with vibrant colors were preserved for their plumage, symbolic meaning, and screeching chatter. Some were employed in ceremonies after being trained to mimic speech. Others, living rainbows sitting on clay rooftops, were merely admired. Animals were valued by the ancient Greeks for more than just labor or sacrifice. They introduced them to their stories, their houses, and sometimes their philosophical discussions. They enjoyed the tranquil devotion of dogs, the humorous nature of birds, and even the suspiciously cunning nature of geese, even if they weren't exactly the kind to watch cat movies. Geese indeed. Let's talk about that. First, let's talk about dogs. Greeks viewed dogs as symbols of protection and devotion in addition to being devoted companions. Perhaps the most well-known ancient dog is Argos, Odysseus's old hound, who, upon his return to Ithaca after 20 years, remembers his master. In Homer's Odyssey, there is a heartbreakingly loyal episode that is likely the first instance of a nice lad in literary history. The use of guard dogs was widespread, particularly in rural households. Big shaggy breeds, such as the Molossian dog, were valued for their fierceness. They were large enough to scare off intruders, but still gentle enough to lay next to their masters. There was no need for a ringing doorbell in Greek homes. By the gate, they were 120 pounds of snarling muscle. However, there were birds for those who didn't care for slobber. The Greeks loved songbirds, particularly partridges and nightingales, who were frequently housed in fragile cages and trained to imitate tunes. In order to show off their affluence one squawk at a time, wealthier households occasionally purchased exotic birds from the East. Some parrots can be trained to say hello and goodbye before pooping on your scrolls, according to Aristotle's own account of pet bird behaviors in his History of Animals. The geese come next. Barnyard filler was not the only use of these honking sentinels. They were alarm systems. According to one account, Geese even saved Rome, not Greece, but close, by warning the guards of an impending enemy sneak attack by loud honking. Due to their competitive nature, the Greeks probably had equally worried geese protecting their granaries and temples. Philosophers were also fond of animals. Diogenes the Cynic, who famously lived in a barrel and disregarded all social conventions, was so taken by the honesty and simplicity of dogs that he adopted the term cynic, which comes from the Greek word kynikos, which means dog-like. His friends were frequently real stray animals. Pets were not an exception to the ancient Persians' knowledge of elegance. Animals were more than simply ornaments in Persia, from magnificent falcons to the earliest known Persian cat. They served as spiritual and class messengers and, surprisingly, as soft power instruments. First up is the Persian cat, the pride and purr of the Persian people. Long-haired cats are thought to have originated in the mountainous areas of ancient Persia, or present-day Iran, where their thick coats shielded them from the cold. However, the breed as we know it now is a recent refinement. A common characteristic of many emperors, these cats were valued for their beauty, their serene disposition, and their capacity to slumber with regal indifference. Despite not being specifically referenced in early Persian documents, artwork and artifacts indicate cats were kept in aristocratic homes, where their elegance represented wealth and sophistication. Persians, however, maintained elaborate menageries in addition to cats. Exotic creatures gathered from all over their enormous kingdom were housed in private zoos maintained by the Achaemenid emperors, especially Darius and Xerxes. Not only were lions, leopards, bears, and exotic birds trophies, but they also served as evidence of the empire's dominance, having international dignitaries next to a tiger in a cage. Diplomacy with claws is what that is. The Persian nobility also placed a high value on hunting animals. For Basnama, the royal sport of hunting, falcons, hawks, and cheetahs were trained. In addition to being an exclusive hobby, falconry represented self-control and balance with the environment. The pinnacle of patience and status was teaching a bird to return to your glove. Noblemen with their falcons neatly perched on their wrists, poised for action, or more likely, posturing for royal propaganda, are depicted in Sassanid-era Persian miniatures. Dogs were also involved, particularly hunting hounds, which were employed to pursue boars and gazelles through the rocky landscape. These canines were named, loved, and occasionally even buried with care, just like their Egyptian and Roman counterparts. The dual aspect of ancient Persian pet culture is what makes it so fascinating. These animals served as both discreet image management tools and cherished friends. A magnificent lion in your courtyard or a stunning falcon on your wrist were not merely tokens of personal happiness. They were a live, breathing declaration of authority. One of the biggest archaeological mysteries in history is the Indus Valley civilization, which flourished between 2600 and 1900 BCE. Their rulers are still unidentified. We are unable to decipher their script, and we continue to debate how they fell. We do know, however, from toys, bones, and seals, that the inhabitants of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa had a fondness for animals, some of which were undoubtedly suitable as pets. The atmosphere of the Indus Valley was modest, domestic, and surprisingly healthful, in contrast to the ostentatious pet culture of civilizations such as Rome or Egypt. Numerous clay figures of dogs, not snarling creatures, but amiable floppy-eared friends with wagging tails, have been discovered during archaeological excavation. These were cherished family members rather than representations of conquest. Dog remains discovered adjacent to residences indicate that dogs and people coexisted, with canines serving as friends, home guards, and herding aid. Along with small carts and animal-shaped whistles, dog toys were designed for kids, suggesting that these animals were more than simply practical tools. They were a part of everyday family life. There were even some cats. There is evidence of feline remains in residential areas, albeit they are not as common as they are in Egypt. They were valued for their unobtrusive presence as well as their ability to kill rodents, which was crucial in a society based on granaries. While a little cat sleeps in a nearby sunbeam, you can practically picture a Harappan woman making textiles. But the Indus Valley's most recognizable animal. Numerous seals have the humped bull as a trait. The civilization's tranquil, orderly cities imply that animals of all types were treated with respect, even though these creatures were probably sacred or symbolic rather than pets. Seals and statues even allude to elephants, which may have been semi-domesticated here before anywhere else. The Indus people didn't exaggerate pet burials or display unusual animals like other ancient societies did. Function, familiarity, and harmony appeared to be important to them. Mummified tombs and gilded collars were unnecessary for their animals. All they needed was a place to live and a task to complete. It was never easy to say goodbye to a cherished pet in the ancient world. Whether you were a Mesopotamian farmer, a Roman matron, or a pharaoh, losing an animal companion frequently meant ritual, remembering, and perhaps a more elaborate tiny burial than the typical citizen. Egypt is without a doubt the leader in animal burials, so let's start there. Animals like as dogs, cats, monkeys, ibises, and even crocodiles were meticulously mummified, wrapped in linen, meticulously painted, and interred in animal-only necropolises. Over 4 million mummified ibises were kept at one location close to Saqqara, a feathered homage to the god Thoth, and a reminder that the Egyptians never cut corners. Some pets were interred with their owners or in sarcophagi of their own, bearing inscriptions such as faithful companion in life and death, or beloved of the house. In essence, hieroglyphic pet headstones from antiquity. The Romans and Greeks adopted a more intimate and occasionally tragic strategy. Little lap pets and songbirds were honored with poetic embellishments on stone epitaphs. I am crying as I take you to your final resting place, just as I was happy to bring you home in my arms, according to one Roman tombstone. A canine named Margarita is mourned by another. Although she never yelled without reason, she is now quiet. Even in a situation where life and death came quickly and frequently, these sentiments demonstrated the depth of the emotional link and were not insignificant. Offerings were offered, some pets had their own burial, and some fortunate creatures even had statues constructed in their honor. Pets were buried like family. Animal companions are occasionally mentioned on cuneiform tablets in Mesopotamia, particularly in relation to omens or household prosperity. Records indicate that dogs were given names and, in rare instances, buried in meticulously excavated pits with grave items, such as food or collars, as if to prepare them for the afterlife, even though fewer animal burials have been discovered. Even in ancient China's more practical Indus Valley, evidence of animal funerals points to a subdued respect. Basic graves with dishes or tokens are occasionally positioned next to human tombs, perhaps saying, "You'll need this friend on the other side." One truth remained constant throughout the ancient world. Pets were partners, not possessions. They were honored, loved, and remembered, whether they were covered in clay or buried in gold. Because farewell was never just farewell, regardless of the time period. They made a commitment to meet again in the future. Superstition was a national strategy in ancient Babylon, not a fringe belief. Everything depended on what the sky was doing and what the omens were whispering, from fundamental farming to regal judgments. Babylonian priests read the stars as if they were divine notes from irate gods, always trying to figure out what would happen next. They didn't just study the stars for amusement. Any minor disruption in the sky, an odd cloud, a red moon, or the tail of a comet, was interpreted by the Babylonians as an indication that something was amiss, since they thought the cosmos was a perfectly tuned mechanism run by gods. These weren't merely fascinating astronomical occurrences, They were curses, warnings, or occasionally a side-eye from God. They created a sophisticated divination system to make sense of everything. Celestial omen reading was the most common of these techniques, and it was described in great volumes, such as the Enuma Anu Enlil, which listed thousands of signs found in the sky. It said more than just an eclipse is coming. It stated that the king of Akkad would be killed if the moon was dark on the 14th day and Mars was red in the east. Extremely detailed and demanding. The appointed interpreters were priests known as Baru, who practiced astrology. They spent years learning how to discern oil patterns in bowls, goat livers, and even the way smoke rose from incense. Particularly if you were royalty, you could have to fast, sacrifice goats, or call off a wedding if Jupiter appeared a bit too arrogant one evening. Because they were so paranoid, kings would temporarily install a scapegoat or a stand-in king on the throne amid terrible omens in case the gods were directing their anger towards the crown. Let's just say the replacement didn't receive a pension when the threat passed. The average Babylonian was no exception. Before important life events, people used omen tablets, carried protective amulets, and avoided particular days for travel or childbirth. You might have been cursed in addition to being irritated if your door creaked strangely or a black hound crossed your way. Superstition was not hidden away in ancient Egypt. In hieroglyphics brazen enough to make a god blink, it was engraved on your walls, painted on your coffin, and worn around your neck. The afterlife was much more uncertain than life, and there were several spiritual dangers in between. The answer? Plenty and plenty of amulets. They were more than trinkets. Egyptian amulets were magical technologies, tiny, holy objects thought to channel divine energy and shield the bearer from illness, mishaps, demons, and most importantly, the negative energy of others. Each shape served a purpose. The scarab provided rebirth, regeneration, and a protecting bug-eyed gaze. The jed gave you strength and spine, and the ankh delivered life. Consider it more aesthetically pleasing than traditional insurance. To avoid drowning, kids wore charms in the shape of fish. To prevent miscarriages, pregnant women wore pictures of the frog deity Heket or the lion-headed goddess Sekhmet. Even cats, which are literally gods of the home, wore collars with symbols of protection. The tombs were the most supercharged place for superstition, but you were never too furry to be cursed. The afterlife was perilous. Serpents, crocodile-headed soul-eaters, decapitating demons, basically a cosmic horror obstacle course. As a result, amulets were incorporated into the coffins of the deceased, sewed into their linen wrappings and put over particular organs. The most well-known was the Eye of Horus, also known as Wedja, which was thought to protect, heal, and replenish the body and spirit. Mummies were essentially composed of spiritual hope and encased in bubble wrap. Naturally, dangers exist wherever there is protection. The curse, a form of magical slander, was feared by the Egyptians both in writing and speech. There were actual tomb curses written in strong warnings. If someone disturbs this grave, may the hippopotamus bite him, may the scorpion sting him, and may the crocodile devour him. Not subtle. The purpose of them was to deter tomb robbers and prevent the soul from being disturbed. Perhaps the curses were effective, given the number of unexplained deaths that occurred among archaeologists in the 19th century after they broke into graves. In Egypt, superstition was not about being powerless, it was an active tactic. You didn't simply wait for negative events to occur. Armed with divinely blessed falcons, sacred beetles, and turquoise pendants, you faced the unknown with all the legendary support you could muster. We have democracy, theatre, and philosophy thanks to the ancient Greeks. However, they also instilled in us the belief that spitting 3 times will ward off evil. Yes, that highly sophisticated culture was adamant that you might deceive fate, that praises may irritate the gods, and that speaking someone's name at the wrong moment could lead to your own haunting. Consider names Speaking the name of a deceased person, particularly one who passed away tragically, was thought by the Greeks to be able to call forth their restless spirit. Ghosts were not phantoms from Hollywood. They were ghosts or shades that sat on the edge of the living world, waiting for any word that might make them retreat. Greeks frequently used oblique references to the departed, such as the unlucky one or he who passed beyond, in order to prevent this. Just to be safe, you should include an offering for Hades if you were to mention their name. Then there were the notorious beliefs about the evil eye. It wasn't considered flattering if someone complimented your child on their appearance or health. It might have been a curse. The Greeks devised defenses such as wearing blue-eye amulets, tying red threads around kids, or, if all else failed, physically spitting because the gods disliked arrogance and success aroused jealousy. Just a symbolic tup-tup-tu into the air to drive out negative energy, not directed at anyone. Without calling up heavenly retribution, a Greek mother could gaze upon her child, spit 3 times and continue. Effective. Even the architecture was influenced by superstition. To protect houses, doors were painted red. It was believed that knocking 3 times before entering someone's home would disorient any lingering spirits. Additionally, you should never consider trimming your nails at night. It could be interpreted by the fates as cutting off your own destiny. These fears were the source of income for priests and oracles. Do you want to start a business? Examine the internal organs. Do you wish to get married? Better observe the birds' flight patterns as they pass. An entire economy was based on divine riddles thanks to Apollo's oracle at Delphi. Fearsome, part political counselor, half fortune teller. With all of their roads, laws, and buildings, the Romans were also extremely and even comically superstitious. Beneath the austere togas and polished marble, there was a culture that used omens, charms, sacred chickens, and an odd number of winged penises to try and outsmart fate. First, let's look at those fascinating, tiny amulets that resemble male genitalia and occasionally have bells or wings. These were serious matters. They served as emblems of protection. The Romans thought that the phallus could protect against the evil eye, or malocchio, and guarantee fertility, good fortune, and success in general. They can be seen hanging from children's necklaces carved into walls and worn as jewelry. Apparently they were not very good at being subtle. Superstition permeated daily existence. Salve would be the first thing someone would say if you sneezed. To keep a soul from leaving your body, not to be courteous. It was unlucky to step on your own shadow when taking a pledge, letting your toga pin fall to your left. Be mindful of your back. The art of divining bird behavior, or augury, was very important in Roman politics. Whether the gods approved of a decision was decided by augurs, religious officials who had received training in bird watching. Do you want to start a new temple or declare war? Release the sacred hens first, then watch to see if they consume anything. It was exceedingly bad if they refused to eat their grain. In one well-known instance, when the hens refused to eat, a Roman commander impatiently hurled them overboard. The struggle was lost by him. Romans, of course, were also constantly alert due to protective spirits in the home. The guardian spirits of the pantry and household, the luries and penates, had shrines in every dwelling. To keep them satisfied, families regularly offered food, wine, or incense. You face the chance of bad luck, damaged grain, or things breaking just before dinner guests arrive if you forget to do it. Roman brides wore veils to protect themselves from envious spirits in addition to being fashionable. Bulla amulets were given to newborns to protect them from curses. According to reports, even Emperor Augustus shunned the ancient Roman tradition associated with failure omens, stepping with his left foot first. Superstition in ancient China was more of a daily functioning system than a fringe psychosis. It influenced commercial transactions, calendar selections, architecture, and even the orientation of your bed. Avoiding ghosts, unlucky numbers, and whatever might be hiding outside your ancestral shrine were all important, but so was being in harmony with the universe. First, let's talk about the numbers. Due to the abundance of homophones in the Chinese language, some numbers are considered lucky or cursed. The number 8, BA, which means riches and sounds like FA, was thought to be very fortunate, but the term for death sounded alarmingly near to the number 4, Psi. As a result, whole buildings were built without a fourth story, and significant occasions were planned to avoid that ominous number. Another thing to think about every day was ghosts. A rich world of spirits, some kind, some lost and furious, was part of Chinese cosmology. People thought that the underworld's gates opened and restless ghosts roamed freely on specific occasions, such as the Ghost Festival in the 7th lunar month. To placate the dead and prevent them from turning into resentful freeloaders in the land of the living, people burnt paper offerings, counterfeit money, clothing, and even homes at this period. However, superstition was ingrained in the architecture and did not only haunt the calendar. The arrangement of buildings, doors, furnishings, and graves was determined by feng shui, which translates to wind and water. A house in a bad location could cause cosmic energy to be disrupted, leading to failure, illness, or worse, a haunting. In order to maintain qi, or life force, flowing freely and negative energy halted at the gate, entire towns were designed using feng shui concepts. Newborns were also protected by superstition. In order to deceive envious spirits into ignoring them, babies were frequently given milk names, which were short-lived nicknames that made them sound uninteresting or even unpleasant, such as small dog or ugly boy. A kid would only be given a true name after surviving infancy, and this was frequently determined by fortune tellers using astrological indications and birth charts. The daily defensive strategy included ancestor worship, crimson threads, jade pendants, and protective charms. Every act of reverence served as a spiritual firewall, and every shrine served as a telephone to the dead. In addition to their reputation for sailing, raiding, and ridiculous fur clothing, the Vikings were also extremely superstitious. The gods, fate, wired, and things that bumped in the forest were all taken extremely seriously in the Norse civilization. Every mound may conceal a ghost, every tree may harbor a spirit, and every rune engraved on a sword may either defend you or bring disaster to your ancestors. First, let's talk about runes. The runes were thought to have magical power in addition to being a writing system. A single symbol engraved on bone, stone, or wood could evoke a curse, provide protection, or bring good fortune. To guarantee victory, warriors inscribed runes on their shields and weapons. For good soil, farmers fashioned them into ploughs and barns. I have etched these runes for lunacy and love, according to one notorious rune inscription, the traditional Viking dating method. The Norns, 3 enigmatic creatures that crafted the fates of gods and humans, were in charge of Norse society's obsession with fate. Not only was it stupid to try to avoid fate, but it was also risky. The Norns have knitted something for Odin that even the chief god dreaded. People used dreams, omens, and Seda, a magical kind of Norse magic frequently used by vulvas or women, to navigate this invisible web. For a price, they provided blessings, curses, or prophecies. The dead, or more precisely, the Draga, then appeared. Your nice, rest-in-peace spirits weren't these. The Draga were undead fighters who were frequently envious, vindictive, and very foul-smelling. A man would emerge from his burial mound to torment the living if he had been especially avaricious or cruel during his lifetime. Serious superstition, incorrectly buried weapons, binding charms, and occasionally even stake the corpse through the chest were all necessary to prevent this. The Vikings were already taking no chances long before Dracula, not to mention the native spirits of the land, trolls, elves, and landvetters. You risk your farm strangely catching fire or your cows abruptly ceasing to provide milk if you enrage them by building in the incorrect spot. To keep them placated, offerings such as bread, milk, or even a small amount of beer were frequently placed out. Superstition was not a fringe notion in ancient India. It permeated every aspect of daily life, including architecture, medicine, religion, and even grammar. It was a delightfully thin line between ritual, tradition, and pure cosmic anxiety. If you believed that crossing a black cat was unlucky, imagine living in a world where a jealous gaze could kill your cow, ruin your crops, or cause a fever in your unborn child. Let's start with the evil eye, also known as the drishti dosha, or literally spoiled by a look. It was commonly held that a person's stare, motivated by adulation or envy, might actually do harm. Infants were especially at risk. Parents would shield their children by applying a little black dot to their forehead or cheek, which would divert or ward off the evil eye. Some adults even covered their eyes with kohl. For energetic protection, not fashion, imagine a potropaic eyeliner. They also took shrapa, or curses, very seriously. India's epic stories, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, are essentially propelled by curses. A king could be cursed by a rejected sage. A whole dynasty could be cursed by a rejected goddess. You were doomed for the next 38 lifetimes if you spoke the wrong thing to the wrong rishi. In order to prevent this, individuals made significant offerings and showed reverence for holy persons at all times, in case they were feeling angry that day. However, superstition was not solely based on fear. It was also about balance and safety. Ayurveda, an ancient Indian medical system, identified chakras as the body's energy centers and employed particular rites, mantras, and even gemstones to treat physical or spiritual imbalances. It wasn't merely showy to wear a ruby. It was said to boost confidence and fortify your heart chakra. The nerves were soothed by emeralds, sapphires. Well, take care. They were strong, and if worn improperly, might backfire. A blue diamond should never be trusted without first consulting an astrologer. Daily routines were also influenced by superstition. Cutting your nails on Tuesdays was unfortunate. If you didn't wait and drink some water first, sneezing just before you left the house was a terrible sign. While breaking a mirror was not feared, spilling milk was a sign of prosperity, and walking barefoot on rice was a significant matter. Superstition was the headline, not a footnote, in ancient African cultures. In many places, from West African kingdoms like Nok and If to Nubia and Kush, the spiritual and material worlds were closely intertwined. All diseases had a spiritual origin. Every bad thing happened for a reason. You'd better hire a diviner if you didn't know what the spirits desired. Quick! Ancestor veneration was at the core of many African superstitions. Not all ancestors were simply recalled. They took an active part in family activities. It wasn't random if a neighbor gave you a funny look, a child became ill, or crops failed. It can indicate that someone employed juju, a type of magical energy or sorcery, against you, or that the ancestors were not happy. The cure? Wear a protection amulet created by a skilled craftsperson, consult a spiritual expert, or serve libations at the family shrine. In relation to protection, African societies created complex talisman and amulet systems. Known as gree-gree in West Africa, they were tiny pouches that were tied to doorways or worn on the body and included plants, bones, beads, and occasionally written poetry. A gree-gree could ward off jealousy, curses, and evil spirits. Some were even created expressly to draw fertility, fortune, or love. A wearable wish list with spiritual Wi-Fi, essentially. Another important tool for navigating the unknown was divination. Systems like Azifar, which the Yoruba practiced, revealed hidden truths through poetry, sacred palm nuts, and complex oral traditions. An expert diviner might identify the cause of misfortune and recommend the appropriate ritual, bath, charm, or offering to bring things back into harmony. It was a combination of divine communication, therapy, and investigative work. Words had great power. A blessing uttered out loud could change destiny. A curse could last for many generations. The day of birth or the circumstances surrounding it were frequently taken into consideration while choosing names. Saying someone's name, particularly during a ritual, may cause spiritual retaliation. Silence, when needed, was a protective shield. Ancient African tribes never practiced superstition arbitrarily. The system of spiritual accountability was intricate. Blessings would come if you led a decent life, respected the unseen powers around you, and paid respect to your elders. However, disregard an offering at your grandmother's grave, offend a tree spirit, or disregard a dream. Then when your roof leaks, your goat stops eating, and your luck disappears like morning dew, don't be shocked. Superstition was more than just folklore across the ancient world. From the foreboding skies of Babylon to the gilded amulets of Egypt, from Chinese feng shui to the panic-carved runes of Norse mythology. It was humanity's attempt to impose purpose, order, and protection on a world that often gave none. Empires fell, children perished, crops failed, and epidemics arrived. Without weather forecasts or medications, people resorted to the next best thing: signs, rituals, charms, and curses. Even though these systems were separated by mountains and oceans, it's amazing how similar they were. Everyone feared the evil eye. Everybody had a sacred number. Everybody in the village has that one elderly person who knew what prayer to whisper on a windy night and which root to burn. But ancient superstition wasn't just reactive, it was creative, a method to make the invisible world controllable. An earthquake was beyond your control, but you could place a protection idol beneath your front entrance. Death could not be prevented, but it was possible to prevent the dead from rising in retaliation by using a string to bound their mouth shut. You could wear an obsidian amulet charged beneath a blood moon, paint a blue eye, or hang garlic, but you couldn't see a virus. Superstition had societal purposes as well. It strengthened moral conduct. Disrespect was punished with curses in India. Breaking a family custom may spell disaster for your home in ancient Rome. In China, if you don't pay respect to your ancestors, your descendants may be born under unlucky stars. In a way, superstition was society's spiritual code, equal parts fear, faith, and etiquette. Not to be overlooked is the emotional goal. Superstition gave people something to do when the unimaginable happened. It provided techniques for protection, grieving rites, and little everyday actions that afforded people a moment of power, like as whispering charms or tapping on wood. We still harbor remnants of these ideas, wearing lucky clothes, throwing salt over our shoulders, and avoiding specific numbers. Any ancient society would nod in agreement, so feel free to laugh if you wish. After all, to them, superstition wasn't ignorance, it was armor. Therefore, you weren't being foolish if you fastened a horseshoe over your door, lighted incense for your ancestors, or spit 3 times to confound a ghost. You were engaging in one of the oldest survival techniques used by humans, attempting to reason with the invisible while also fearing and hoping.